Everybody keeps shouting, disclosure, disclosure. But here's the problem. Disclosure of what? Aliens? Secret technology? Interdimensional intelligence? Because there's a darker lane in this conversation that never goes away. The claim that the phenomenon isn't extraterrestrial at all. It's spiritual deception. And if that sounds too wild to take seriously, let me give you one true ingredient from history. One of the founding fathers in America's early rocket world also aligned himself with Aleister Crowley's occult movement. Yep. And it happened within the same defense era culture that thrives on secrecy. So today we're not chasing lights in the sky. We're chasing the thing that decides what the lights mean. Because in the UFO world, the real battlefield isn't evidence. It's the interpretation. Today, I want to dip my feet into the strangest narratives in the modern UFO world, the Collins elite. An insider story claiming that a fraction in and around the national security world concluded the UFO phenomenon wasn't extraterrestrial at all, but demonic. Holy shades of The Exorcist. Now I'm going to be clear from the beginning. This is built from books and interviews and claim sources, not a neat declassified binder that says College Elite Members List. And if you're thinking, this sounds crazy, good, keep that skepticism. But also keep in mind, because the reason this story survives is that it continues to match the emotional texture of the modern UFO conversation. Fears, secrecy, weirdness, and competing agendas. I mean, you can't scroll the internet for 2 minutes without hearing disclosure. I mean, documentaries, podcasts, hearings, whistleblowers, it's everywhere. And what that creates is two battles at the same time. Battle number one. Is something happening? Well, battle number two. What story explains it? Because the moment people accept that anything anomalous exists, the next fight becomes, is it physical? Is it spiritual? Is it psychological? Or is it propaganda? And the second fight is where the Collins elite narrative thrives. Because it's not just an explanation, it's a warning. The most powerful thing in any mystery isn't the evidence. It's the interpretation. Whoever controls the interpretation controls the public reaction. That's true with politics, religion, and yes, UFOs. And here's why that matters. Disclosure is not a single event. It's a story fight. I mean, one person hears UAP and thinks physics. Another hears it, thinks propaganda. Another hears and thinks, oh, it's spiritual warfare. Same data. 3 different meaning systems. And that's why this topic never cools down, because it just isn't about what people saw. It's about what people fear it means for humanity. Not just are we alone, but are we being manipulated? And once a population gets primed to expect a world-changing reveal, the next question becomes, who's going to frame that reveal? So, what is the Collins elite? The author Nick Redfern, who writes about unidentified flying objects in his book Final Events and the secret government group on demonic UFOs in the afterlife, are connected to this particular framing. Final Events is one of the primary source texts for the Collins elite plot as it is currently presented online. And the group is described as an alleged network of military intelligences and adjacents that believed the UFO phenomenon was a deceptive intelligence. So then this group labeled the Collins elite is an alleged insider narrative claiming the UFO UAP phenomenon is not extraterrestrial, but a deceptive, spiritual intelligence. Here's the core idea in plain language. UFOs aren't the main thing. The entities behind the encounters are the main thing. And the alien costume is a mask that fits that modern era. So in that worldview, disclosure isn't exciting. Disclosure is dangerous because it's not new neighbors. It's a trap. And many people misunderstand this point. They think demonic UFO means ghost driving saucers. But the claim is subtle. The phenomenon appears to manipulate perception, shape belief, produce religious-like experiences. That's why the story frames it as spiritual warfare. Now, let's talk about why people slide into the spiritual lane at all. I mean, if it were just lights in the sky, we'd keep the aviation physics, right? But the UFO world is loaded with reports of bedroom encounters, missing time, messages or telepathic impressions, poltergeist type activity, obsession, depression, fear, and sometimes occult overlap. Channeling, seances, ritual language. Notice the pattern? These reports don't just describe an object. They describe a relationship, an interaction that feels personal, invasive, and basically psychologically sticky. I mean, that's why some people stop treating it like aviation and start treating it like possession, temptation, deception, religious categories. Now you can say sleep paralysis, folklore, trauma, suggestibility, cultural contamination, and you might be right in some cases. But whether it's literal or psychological, the effect is the same. It produces experience that behave like a belief engine. Now, do those patterns prove a spiritual origin? No. But they invite a spiritual interpretation because the phenomenon doesn't behave like a simple machine. And that's the Collins elite logic. If it behaves like deception, treat it as deception. This is why I keep repeating the word alleged, because online people tend to treat Collins elite like a stamped government agency, like there's a badge in a building and a receptionist. But the way the story behaves is more like a tradition, a narrative passed through books and interviews and secondhand accounts. And those narratives don't survive because they're tidy. They survive because they explain the feeling of the UFO world. Secrecy, confusion, fragmentation, fear. And the Collins elite story is powerful because it doesn't just claim something is real. It claims something is real and it wants something from you. And the essential part? Many contact narratives sound like religion. Chosen people, new revelation, cosmic enlightenment. That is precisely why a religious-minded faction would interpret it as counterfeit spirituality. What if I told you one of the founding personalities in America's early rocket world also helped bankroll an occult movement tied to Aleister Crowley? Now, before you roll your eyes, hold on, because this isn't a witches built NASA story. But it is a story about secrecy, belief, and why certain people in the national security world became convinced that something spiritual was intertwined with advanced technology. Meet Jack Parsons, a brilliant, volatile pioneer of early American rocketry. He's connected to Caltech rocket crowd in Southern California, the same orbit that leads the JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and the defense-funded rocket pipeline. Parsons helped advance solid propellants and rocket experimentation at a time when the U.S. military was desperately interested in reliable thrust. jet-assisted takeoff missiles and the whole future of propulsion. But at night, Parsons stepped into a completely different universe. And this is the part most people miss. That overlap isn't proof of anything supernatural. It's proof that a brilliant technical mind can be drawn to metaphysical systems, especially in areas defined by war, secrecy, and existential threat. I mean, Parsons lived in a world where a few equations could change the balance of power on Earth. That kind of pressure doesn't just generate technology. It generates myth and ritual and sometimes obsession. And once you accept that, the Parsons story stops being a bizarre footnote and starts looking like a template for how belief can travel inside high-security environments without leaving a neat paper trail. Parsons wasn't just casually into the occult. He connected with the Thelemi, the religious philosophy founded by Aleister Crowley, and got involved with Crowley circles with the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis. And before Ozzy sang those lyrics, "Mr. Crowley, what went on in your head? Oh, Mr. Crowley, did you talk to the dead? You fooled all the people with magic. Yeah, you waited on Satan's call." Well, Aleister Crowley wasn't just a spooky name in a black cape. He was real. Notorious British occult writer who practiced what he called magic, M-A-G-I-C-K, magic, and built a religious system called the Thelemi, and even leaned into the tabloid villain role. He called himself Le Beast 666. Talk about the Book of Revelation. Well, Crowley's most famous claim is that the Book of the Law, which was dictated to him in Cairo in April 1904 by an entity he called Aiwass. He described it as a voice communicating over his left shoulder, and the text itself presents Aiwass as the author or the messenger. And you don't have to accept Crowley's claims to understand their impact, because what Crowley offered wasn't just spooky imagery. It was a framework that intelligence can contact you through altered states, rituals, symbols, and language. In other words, meaning can arrive like a message. The idea, whether you call it revelation, channeling, psychology, becomes a bridge between lights in the sky and belief in your head. Now, related to that, Crowley also built a whole magical system around it, attaining knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Basically, a direct spiritual contact communication experience that practitioners seek through ritual. Now here's where it gets relevant. Jack Parsons wasn't a casual fanboy. Britannica notes he and his wife attended a Thelemi ceremony in 1939 and quickly became disciples. And Parsons' devotion to Crowley's ideas became a major part of his off-hours life. Jack Parsons, while working at the bleeding edge of American rocketry, claimed during the Babylon working experience of 1946 that the presence of the goddess came upon me, and I was commanded to write the following. And he produced Liber 49, the Book of Babylon, which he presented as communication from Babylon. Again, this isn't me telling you what happened. It's me telling you how he described it as something received, commanded, transmitted. Now that matters because it's the same shape you see in so many contact stories today. Messages, downloads, telepathy, instructions, not just sightings, but communications. So even if you're a skeptic, notice the structure. The phenomenon becomes less like a vehicle and more like a narrator. And whether you believe it or not, the historical point is simple. Both men framed their lives around communication, not just ideas, but messages coming from beyond ordinary reality. And the crossover into the Collins Elite Vibe is psychological, not conspiratorial. When you have a defense elite rocket world built on secrecy and clearances, and one of the most talented minds is openly immersed in a worldview full of ritual and entities and spiritual language, you've created the perfect conditions for later insiders to fear the interpretation layer. Not the occult ran the space program, but The belief systems can ride shotgun inside high technology cultures, and secrecy make those stories metastasize. And then the story gets stranger, because Parsons later becomes entangled with L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology guy, in a chaotic episode involving rituals and relationships and money and betrayal, and that's a whole nother story. But this is where the internet kicks in the door and everybody loves to hear. The occult ran the space program. What? The occult, it ran the space program. But here's the honest version. Parsons or Crowley did not run NASA. Crowley died in 1947, long before NASA even existed. And there's no hard evidence that Crowley's philosophy guided Pentagon policy. Here's the trap. People hear a real historical weirdness and then jump straight to a total conclusion. That's how legends work. But the honest version is usually more interesting. Not the occult ran the space program, but in a secretive national security ecosystem, unusual personal beliefs can coexist with high technology and later get reinterpreted as evidence of hidden control. That's how the story grows roots, a real spark, then a narrative wildfire. What is true is more unsettling in a different way. America's early rocket world was a tight pipeline between genius, defense money, and security culture. And Parsons, because of his associations and behavior, eventually becomes a liability inside that system. And if you live in this topic long enough, you will see three broad lanes, and I'm going to bring them out for you. Ready? Lane number one, like a highway. Nuts and bolts, ET. Nuts and bolts, ET. A craft, biological, star systems. Okay. Lane number two, interdimensional, consciousness, trickster behavior, reality bending. And in lane number three, there's spiritual warfare, deception, moral agenda, religious implications. And the Collins elite narrative sits in lane number three. A helpful line to remember is this: same sightings, different story. This is why modern voices matter. Even if you disagree with them, they're not just offering opinions. They're providing interpretation frameworks that shape the views of thousands of viewers. And frameworks are powerful, because once you accept a framework, every new whistleblower, every new clip, every new claim gets slotted into the meaning machine. For some people, UAP is a technological puzzle. For others, it's a puzzle of consciousness. For the spiritual warfare lane, it's a moral puzzle. What is it doing to you in belief? What is it producing in people? Because people don't just see data. They see it through a worldview. Let's talk about how the worldview is carried forward a little bit today. I want to start with a guy named L.A. Marzulli. His overall position is blunt and consistent. He frames much of the UFO phenomenon as a dark deception, not friendly visitors, not neutral science, but an intelligence that mimics whatever will work on the human mind. In Marzulli's world, aliens are not a new religion. They are a counterfeit of faith, a spiritual lie, wearing modern clothes. Marzulli is not pro-UFO. His UFO is real, but not what you think, and the difference matters. Now, Timothy Alberino often overlaps with the same biblical unseen realm worldview, but he adds a crucial nuance. In his book, Birthright, he pushes back on the simplistic phrase, aliens are demons. Because in his view, the category demon has a meaning, and many encounter claims include physicality, bodies, technology, and hardware. So Alberino's warning is, don't reduce a complex phenomenon to one lazy label. His position lands like this: yes, there's deception. Yes, there's a spiritual dimension, but be precise. Because if you misdiagnose it, you misunderstand what you're facing. So if Marzulli is the alarm, Alberino is the strategist. Same battlefield, but a more detailed map. And sometimes two people agree on danger, but disagree on taxonomy. Now we get to the modern fuel of this worldview, experiencer accounts. Whether you believe them or not, the abduction encounter narratives are where the spiritual framing catches fire. I mean, these are lifelong experiences. Fear and trauma, claims of hybridization programs, and claims of telepathic messaging, claims that evoke Jesus, stop it. These are the kinds of details that make the phenomenon feel less like exploration and more like invasion. And that's why it plugs directly into the Collins elite story. Testimony isn't proof, but testimony builds culture. That's the key. And this is where this topic gets ethically complicated, because experiential stories are often told through pain and fear and trauma and confusion. But even if you're skeptical, the human reality is still real. People live as if it happened. Come on. That's why testimony is such a powerful fuel. It doesn't have to be courtroom proof to shape culture, create communities, and build a lane for spiritual interpretation. One modern example that fits this ecosystem is Corinne Wilkerson and her book, Stolen Seed, Evil Harvest. It's presented as a first-person, lifelong experiencer account. Abductions, fear, and hostile agenda, often discussed with hybridization themes. And what makes it relevant to this Collins elite discussion is that it's positioned inside the same spiritual warfare lane, including its connection to Marzulli's world. Now, I'm going to be careful. This is not courtroom evidence, okay? It's personal testimony and interpretation. But it matters because it shows how the demonic deception lens is applied to modern times. The Collins elite claim the phenomenon is spiritually dangerous deception. Wilkerson framing the phenomenon as evil, invasive, and spiritually consequential. That's why this fits. In a modern case file that keeps the worldview emotionally alive, you don't have to accept every detail to recognize the pattern of fear, control, and spiritual framing. No, let's talk about a piece that feels like practical application of the Collins elite worldview, Joe Jordan, and the CE4 research counseling ministry style. Jordan is often described as having MUFON roots as an investigator, then shifting into a framework where abduction is not contact, but spiritual assault, something to resist, not welcome. And his central claim is the reason that fits into the Collins elite story so perfectly. That many abduction experiences can be halted, ready? By invoking the authority of Jesus Christ. Now, whether you think this is a spiritual reality or psychological conditioning, here's why it matters. It functions like an internal experiment inside the subculture. If this works, then it means something. If saying the word of Jesus stops something, it means something. And if people report the same pattern, it becomes a pillar of belief, a repeatable scripture that reinforces the spiritual warfare interpretation. Again, not proof, but it's that kind of claim that keeps this lane alive because it feels actionable. Again, that's not a government memo. That's ministry interpretation based on reported case patterns. But within the worldview, it's crucial. It's a crucial if-then test. If the phenomenon is spiritually deception, then a spiritual response should have an effect. And that is why Joe Jordan is so often brought up in the same conversations as demonic UFO claims. It's presented not as theory, but as a spiritual strategy. I mean, even skeptics can recognize that this is a consistent claim inside the subculture. The phenomenon responds to religious authority language. Now, before we go into the strangest part of the Collins elite story, I want to widen the lens a little bit, because this cross-category weirdness isn't limited to the sky. A lot of you have seen David Pilates. He's known for Bigfoot research and later became widely known for his missing 411 books and disappearances in wilderness areas that he argues there are unusual patterns. Now here's why he fits this episode. Paulides is one of the few public figures who explicitly lives in the overlap zone between wilderness vanishing, Bigfoot lore, and eventually the UAP conversation. He even spoke at a MUFON meeting and joked about how the Bigfoot world doesn't like the UFO world. Yet, there he was, bringing them together in the same room. And then he takes that overlap further with a theme often marketed as the UFO connection, raising questions about whether some disappearances correlate with unusual area phenomenon, even flirting with portal or other dimension speculation. Then at Timothy Alberino's NEFCON conference in 2025, he shared some interesting facts about Bigfoot DNA. Yeah, Paulides asserted that Sasquatch DNA shows a mix of human mitochondrial DNA and a novel non-human nuclear DNA, making it a human relative or even a subspecies of human, not just an ape. Now, fair warning. Critics say he doesn't commit to a single cause, and the missing 411 framework can become a mystery container where people pour in aliens and portals and spirits, whatever they already believe. But here's the reason I'm including them. If the phenomenon really is deceptive and cross-category, you'd expect it to show up in places like deep wilderness, missing person cases, and weird boundary zones, not only lights in the sky. You can even frame them as a theme. Where the map ends, the story begins. And whether you agree with Paulides or not, he's useful here because he represents a public shift. People aren't keeping mysteries in separate boxes anymore. Sky mystery, wilderness mystery, mind mystery, they're blending into one category, the boundary zone, places and moments where people feel the rules break down. Now that blending may be wrong, but it tells you something important about the culture. People are searching for a single story big enough to hold all the weird. Now whether it's predators, weather, human era, or something stranger, the wilderness is where humans are most vulnerable. I'm not going out there, which is precisely where myth and mystery thrive. Now we get to the part specifically, the one that makes people go, wait, what? A famous occult personality, a covert government program with an ominous acronym. A meeting that, if real, would feel like the moment the spiritual warfare lens turned from sermon to strategy. When someone inside decided the UFO problem wasn't nuts and bolts at all. It was a battle for the soul. Yours, mine, all of us. This is the hinge chapter because it's where the story claims the system didn't just study phenomenon. It brushed up against occult personalities and came away frightened. And whether that's true or not, it's a perfect myth mechanic. A public witch figure meets a government-labeled program name. And suddenly the audience feels like they're standing at locked doors that say authorized personnel only. That's why I keep separating labels from claims, because a real label can be used like a crowbar to pry open your imagination. Sybil Leek was an English author specializing in esoteric topics and self-proclaimed psychic who gained prominence as a media personality, often referred to as Britain's most famous witch. She was a public occult celebrity, author, astrologer, psychic witch, figure in popular culture. Not hidden, not obscure, public-facing. Now here's the 1972 meeting claim as it circulates in the Collins elite narrative lane. The claim is upon moving to the United States, Leek was allegedly approached in 1972 by people connected to a government-linked effort known as Often, asked to get involved, and this became part of the origin story of serious officials concluding the phenomenon is spiritual and demonic. And here's the additional layer the story adds. It claims that Collins' elite was informed, and that members met with Leek in the summer of 1972, and it claims a dramatic meeting later in 72 involved trance channeling and a voice from the other side, content that reinforced that this is not ET worldview. Now, the internet leap people make from this is, that means the Pentagon, or religious faction, concluded UFOs are demons and steered policy accordingly. This is a worldview conclusion, not an established fact. Here's the responsible separation. I call thing number one. Okay? Historical program labels like often appear in records connected to MK search or, headings. Thing number two. Later storytelling layers that treat often as proof of occult operations. The existence and definition of Project Often itself is documented in oversight area material, but that documentation does not automatically validate the Sybil Leek meeting story. Important note, Redfern's account is not a declassified document. It's a secondary narrative built from interviews, leads, and claims. So here's the honest position I can say on camera. Yes, these labels exist in historical context. No, that does not automatically validate every dramatic claim attached to them. That's not me dodging. That's just trying to be responsible to my viewers. Because this story is the kind that makes people take one real label and build an entire cathedral of speculation on top of it. How are UFO stories made? Let's look at the disclosure machine. How UFO stories are made and used reveals how intelligent history is full of weird experiments, drugs, behavior, psychology. It doesn't require demons to explain that. But it does create an environment where demon stories feel plausible. You'll hear people say, a religious group controls the Pentagon. I'm not comfortable stating that as fact. But a more accurate framing is there are claims that some officials interpreted UAP through a spiritual warfare lens, and that worldview may have influenced what got supported or discouraged in certain pockets of this system. I know it's still a strong claim, but it's closer to what this narrative actually suggests. It also explains why the topic triggers people, because it implies this isn't just science and secrecy. It implies that ideology and theology may be shaping national security decisions. Let's zoom back out again because the story's not happening in a vacuum. We're in a cultural movement where disclosure is its own genre. Documentaries, interviews, social media, blockbuster entertainment. That's why I think it's fair to mention two things without going conspiratorial. One, the general age of disclosure-style media wave. Something is coming. Truth will be known. I found that term an interesting one. Truth will be known. To use the word truth, that reminds me of a biblical passage when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Just saying. So number two, Spielberg's upcoming movie titled Disclosure Day. Again, not claiming a connection, just noting that the public imagination is being trained to expect a world-changing reveal. This is how you get an expectational spiral. Media trains the audience to anticipate a reveal. Algorithms reward the most dramatic framing, and then the public starts demanding answers. But the loudest voices are the one offering the clearest story, not the most careful truth. That's why categories matter. Confirmed, claimed, interpretive. Because if you don't separate them, you don't get disclosure. You get a belief stampede. So once you accept that, you understand the real battleground. Not only whether something appears, but what story is everyone told to believe about it? And this is the perfect moment to remind you, the more sensational the topic, the more careful we have to be. If you want truth, you need categories, confirmed, claimed, interpretive. And if you want to go deeper, I have a book coming out on that issue called Disclosure Wars, The Collins Elite, The Legacy Program, and The Battle for Meaning. And I will introduce it on this site very soon. So, let me end with the cleanest, most responsible way to hold all this. Bucket number 1, documented. Do we have official labels? Real history confirmed these events. Bucket number 2, claimed. Insider narratives like Collins Elite, the Sybil Leek 1972 meeting claim. Bucket number 3, interpretive. Marzulli's Great Deception lens. Al Barino's nuanced spiritual warfare lens. Experiential testimony like Wilkerson, and ministry strategies like Joe Jordan. You don't have to accept the entire Collins story to understand why it survives. It offers a worldview that explains not only the phenomenon, but the fear around it. So, here's the final question. Well, maybe not, but it's close to it. If disclosure happens, if the world is told, here's the truth, who controls the meaning? Because if you're watching carefully, you'll realize the fight isn't only over whether UAP exists. It's over whether the public will interpret it as science, spirituality, or psychological warfare. And that interpretation will shape everything: policy, religion, culture, fear, funding, and the stories our kids grow up believing. So when people say disclosure, I always ask one more question. Disclosure? Under whose definition? Tell me in the comment section what your lane is. Remember lane number 1, nuts and bolts ET, craft, biology, stars. Number 2, interdimensional consciousness, trickster behavior, reality bending. Or lane number 3, spiritual warfare. And if you think Parsons is an anomaly or a warning sign, don't forget to click that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next round.